My name is Raphael Raphael. Today is October 23rd, 2020, and I have the pleasure of interviewing Steve Brown for the Center on Disability Studies Oral History Project. Because of the current pandemic and social distancing measures, I'm in Honolulu, and Steve Brown is in Surprise, Arizona, and we're speaking remotely to each other via Zoom. Steve, thank you very much for meeting today. I'm really honored to get a chance to talk with you about your work.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for asking, Raphael.
So I'd like to jump right in. And the first thing I want to ask you about, before we talk about work and your work with CDS, I just want to ask you if you could say a little bit about your upbringing.
Sure. So I come from my income, middle class, Jewish family. I was raised in primarily Kalamazoo, Michigan, from the time I was about 4 till I was 16. So I consider actually Portage, which is in those days was a little rural town next to Kalamazoo. So people know Kalamazoo and not Portage. It was a really wonderful place to grow up. It was pretty rural. We lived in a neighborhood, actually it was called Hellenbrook Village. So it was a little neighborhood kind of by itself where the reason I thought about middle class by income is as far as this neighborhood went, we were kind of on the poor is not the right word, less income section. So there were a lot of doctors and lawyers, and there was one person who owned a car dealership. My dad was a psychologist who didn't have a doctorate, so he didn't quite fit into that. He worked at, when I was a kid, he worked at primarily a child guidance clinic and a state hospital. And he did some other things after I left him. I'm the oldest of 3 kids. And when I was 5, I started limping for no explainable reason. So I eventually, my father's parents lived in Kalamazoo. He grew up in Kalamazoo. And my grandmother particularly had a history with the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota. And so when no doctor in Kalamazoo could figure out what was going on, they put me on a plane. So I went on my first plane ride when I was 5, which in those days was very unusual. This is 56, I think. And they did a couple of biopsies in my legs and diagnosed me with something called Gaucher disease, which I'll spell. It's Gaucher, was a French doctor named Gaucher who identified this around the turn of the 20th century. So in those days, they knew not a whole lot. They knew there were several types. I had what they called the adult type, which meant you tended to live to an average age. And they predicted I might have some pain. And other than that, not a whole lot. I know this because my mother kept the letters, correspondence from this doctor at the Mayo Clinic. However, he was wrong. I've had a lot of pain during my life, very intense chronic pain and many bone breaks, particularly starting when I was a teenager. With Gaucher, you can actually have spontaneous breaks, which I used to say I didn't have, but I think I have had them now. So I was an athlete wannabe despite my body. My heroes were baseball players primarily, and I loved sports. In Michigan, of course, you couldn't go outside a lot. So spring and summer, I was out as much as I could be, playing baseball and basketball and football and whatever else until I couldn't. So that had a kind of a big impact when I was growing up. I also, in Gaucher, there's something that these days they call bone crises. They are incredibly painful. I've heard them compared, not a comparison I can make, but I've heard them compared to labor. And people who can make that comparison have said, it's about like labor, it's worse than labor, it's not quite as bad as labor. However, these lasted about 2 weeks. Oh. So in my life, I've written a lot about pain, and you can imagine why. And when I was, like I said, they call them now bone crises, but when I was a kid, we called them attacks. And I think that viscerally is what it felt like. It felt like being attacked. So I spent a lot of my youth, probably in ways I had no clue about, trying to adapt to what my body was doing. But at the same time, I went to college, I went to school. You wanted to say something. I'm going on and on, right?
No, please go ahead. I was just going to ask you, with this upbringing in Hellenbrook and your early diagnosis, when did you first become aware of discrimination that people with disabilities might experience?
Yeah, so much later in life. When I was growing up, I didn't consider myself, and nobody I knew that I'm aware of anyway, considered me to have a disability.
Yeah.
I got sick a couple times a year, or I broke bones. But there were two kids in our Sunday school. Both were not my age. I didn't really know them, but one had one older and one younger, but both had polio and used Canadian crutches. They were the people with disabilities that I was aware of. So from a today's perspective of ableism, you could say that was discrimination on my part, but I certainly didn't think of it that way then. My starkest awareness of discrimination comes from one of my own experiences. And I think there are probably things I was aware of in some sense before then, but I don't even know if you've ever heard this story, Raphael, but it's about when I was discriminated against and looking for employment. Does that ring a bell with you?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That's a really important.
Yeah. So I'm gonna, because the air conditioning here just came on.
That's okay. That's okay.
I'm gonna turn my sound up a little so I can hear you better.
Okay.
So, like I said, in a lot of ways, it was an idyllic childhood. My parents moved to Illinois when I was the summer before I was a senior in high school. And I ended up actually going to 4 colleges. I went to Southern Illinois my first 2 years at a very interesting time because my freshman fall semester was 69, which means that my freshman, well, it wasn't actually semester at SIU, it was quarters, but the spring was Kent State and Jackson State, and we actually closed the school. So it was a really interesting time. So anyway, I went to SIU, then I went to University of Arizona, and I knew that from a very early age, we thought that part of what made my disability worse was cold. And so I knew I wanted to go west to warmth as soon as I could. Now, in retrospect, it's probably not cold as much as it is weather pressure changes. But I'm still, I try to live in warm weather places like the Phoenix area where I am now. So anyway, so I went to University of Arizona, I got my BA in history, and they called it government, political science there. And then I went to New Mexico State University in Las Cruces, southern New Mexico, where I got my MA in history. And then University of Oklahoma, where I got my PhD in history. So in 1982, I graduated in 81. There were essentially no jobs in the country for social scientists, which is how people called history. I personally think it's more humanities, but that's a whole nother discussion. So anyway, there were, I think in my particular area, which was US intellectual history, I don't know, there were 4 jobs, 6 jobs, something like that. I knew somebody from Oklahoma wasn't going to get one of those. But my department, and in this continuing stream of consciousness, much later in life, I learned why there were so few jobs. Because the people who were about 10 years older than me had gotten all the jobs. And that didn't really hit me in a real understandable way until people started retiring. I'm like, oh yeah, okay, no wonder none of us could get jobs. These people 10 years older were getting them all. So anyway, so there were no jobs. my department decided that they'd create a one-year position for a graduating doctoral student to teach, and hopefully to look for a job and find a job during that year. So I was the second person to get one of those. I taught these very large freshman history classes, 300, 400 students. And in one of my first classes that fall, so this is now 82, 82, 81, I don't know. Anyway, one of those years, two students came up to me after my first lecture and said, "Can we tape your lectures? You talk really fast." And one was blind and one had a visual impairment. And I said, "Sure." And then I said, "And I use a cane." And we talked a little bit about that. And over the next few weeks, we got to know each other a little bit. And they, at one point, came up to me and said, "There's this new organization in town. It's called the Independent Living Project. And would you be interested in volunteering?" And I was like, "Yeah, okay, what does this entail?" And they said, "Well, you come to a meeting and you'll see," basically. And I have to say, at that point in my life, I don't think I loathed anything more than meetings. Because my experience of meetings was people got together, they complained, they left, and nothing happened. But because I really wanted to connect to these two students, I said, "Okay, I'll come." So I went, and it was wonderful. The people who were at that meeting were planning a statewide independent living conference. And the only thing at this point I really remember that they were planning was a workshop on sexuality and disability, which was something I had no clue about, but I thought was really interesting. And then they were inviting these two national speakers, neither of whom I'd heard of at that point. One was a guy named Frank Bowe, and he, unfortunately, is no longer with us, but he was this great guy who eventually became an economics professor. But at that point, I think he was the executive director of an organization called the American Association of People with Disabilities. No, American Coalition of Citizens with Disabilities, ACCD. And he was deaf and a writer. And that actually becomes part of my story a little bit later. So, and the other person everybody knows these days, and that was Judy Heumann. So I got to meet Frank, I got to meet Judy, and I didn't know either of them very well at that point, but began relationships with both of them. Kept in contact with. That's a better way of putting it. So anyway, so I said, okay, so I'll volunteer. So I started volunteering for this organization, which at that point kind of meant coming to meetings and being an advisor. So my year ends, no job. I'd had one interview at what in those days we used to call junior colleges, and they didn't like me, I didn't like them. I knew that wasn't going to happen. So I'm sitting in my house that summer of '82, and have a 4-year-old daughter, married, don't know how I'm going to have an income. And my department chair calls, and he says, "There's a company in Tulsa that's interested in finding a historian to write a history of their company. Would you be interested?" And I said, "Sure." Not that I really had any interest, but I wanted the job, right? So I talked to this guy there, and he was impressed with my credentials. I had to write a proposal. He helped me a lot with that, especially the budget, because I really hadn't done much of that before. And verbally, I was hired. So in those days, you could go into airports without security. So he was flying one day from Tulsa to Dallas, and he was stopping in Oklahoma City. And so Oklahoma City is about 20 miles from Norman, where I was. So we agreed to meet for lunch. And I said to him, I'll be easy to recognize. I'm about 6'4", I have a beard, and I use crutches. And he heard crutches and said, "What's wrong?" And I had no problem telling him. So I talked a little bit about Gaucher, and we met. It was a terrible interview, my perspective. It was a terrible interview. I was really nervous, but it ended with him saying that he would call me within a few days to come up to Tulsa and sign the written contract. I'd actually verbally been hired. I'd actually started doing some of the work, And so we left it that way. He was going to call me, and he didn't. So I called him, and we had what turned out to be about a 45-minute conversation, of which the only two things at this point I remember was when he said, "We don't think somebody using crutches can write a book." And now Oklahoma, big football state, right? College football. And at those days, like I said, I was 6'4". I was about 160 pounds at my highest weight. So I was really skinny. So he said, well, maybe if you had the physique of a football player, you'd have the stamina to do this. But since you don't, we don't think you do. Yeah. So I slammed down the phone after that 45-minute conversation, got in my car, drove to the Independent Living Project, and started ranting and raving and asking what I could do. 82. And they said, we don't think there's anything you can do. But call, and I had met this guy briefly who was a lawyer. He worked at a state advocacy office called the Office of Handicap Concerns. And so, same thing. I ranted and raved, and he said, I don't think there's anything you can do. Then I went to a lawyer. Probably less ranting and raving, but same outcome. She said she didn't think there was anything I could do. So my final recourse was to go to the Oklahoma Human Rights Commission. And I filed a complaint with them. And they had about 6 months to return the complaint. And about 7 or 8 months later, they did. And they said, yes, you've been discriminated against. Yes, it's because of your disability, but it's not illegal. There's nothing we can do. So I frequently say about that, I got radicalized about disability anyway, overnight. And I started, it was summer, so I started volunteering every day at the ILP, the Independent Living Project. That fall, they had 2 new positions funded, and I applied and was hired for one as a community skills coordinator, kind of working on skills training, helping people figure out how to navigate the community, peer support, and community organizing, my favorite one. And, but I still tell this story for 2 reasons. 1, people still find it interesting. And 2, the same thing, even post-Americans with Disabilities Act, could happen today. Because it was a company without federal funds and fewer than, I don't know what I think it's 50 employees, but whatever it is, they didn't have very many employees. So ADA wouldn't cover them. However, there is one difference because of the atmosphere. I think if I had gone to a lawyer after ADA, the response would have been different. So that's my first knock on the head awareness of disability discrimination.
And it seems like it also kind of lit your fire to be involved in some kind of advocacy from your own personal experience to make sure that things were different for people.
Yeah, so somebody, when I was writing something, said, you weren't I used to say I was radicalized overnight. They said, no, that's not right. You were radical before then. It was the disability radical. And they're right, because I was involved in civil rights activities. I had been actually one of the many grad students who tried to organize a union and other things like that. So it was the disability awareness. And what it did for me is it was a bit like coming home and meeting other people with disabilities and understanding I had a disability that fit into the context of discrimination and social justice from a disability perspective was like coming home. I got this. This is something that impacts my life. I get this. You know, growing up in a Jewish family, I'd experienced some discrimination because of that. Not a lot, but some. And I'd had Black, I don't know if I would say friends, but I had Black people I was friendly with, and I'd had a Black roommate. And so I was aware of some discrimination in that context. But, you know, when it's like, when it doesn't impact you directly, you get it in a different way.
Yeah. So you're already this kind of existing framework you had about social justice, these different experiences, and your passion for social justice, it becomes activated in a very different way. And it sounds like it also changes the way that you think about yourself, and changes the way that you what you see as your own identity.
Absolutely.
So I want to come back to that, but can you bring us to how we get to CDS? How do you get to the Center on Disability Studies at University of Hawaii at Manoa?
Well, I frequently say I've had a checkered career. So, well, there's sort of two ways. This may be a story you've never heard. So first of all, I working at the Independent Living Project in the early 80s in Norman. I worked there 3 years, and then we walked out. There were 6 of us on staff, 5 of us walked out. That's another story. And we walked out because, well, there were a lot of reasons, but the simplest way to put it is that in those days, many boards of independent living centers were run by either professionals or parents of people with disabilities. In this particular case, it was an organization called the United Cerebral Palsy of Cleveland County, the county we were in. There were, I don't know, 20 to 25 people on the board. I think one person had a disability when I was working there. My friend, mentor in this world, whose name is Helen Coots, had been on that board. She's a quadriplegic, and she knew about independent living, and she, well, I'll say this because I think it's important. So, as I said, lots of parents and professionals, right? And so they were aware their kids were growing up, and they weren't sure what was going to happen with their kids when they grew up. So they decided they wanted to build a housing complex. And Helen, who was on the board, said, well, you build it, then what? What will they do? And so she actually was aware of some national disability activities and of independent living grants that were just starting. And so she wrote the first independent living grant in Oklahoma, first funded one anyway, and she became the director. But she refused to call it an independent living center. So we called it the Independent Living Project because the board was not a majority of people with disabilities, which was the goal for disability organizations at that point. We walked out partly for that reason. We walked out for some other reasons as well. So 5 of the 6 of us in 1984 walked out of our jobs.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's another story. You can read about that in my book, Movie Stars. There's a chapter called The Walkout. So if you want more background for yourself, if you want more background on that.
And so you're, just to put that in context for folks, I mean, you are, at that time, you're married, you have a child, and in order to make a point and to make change, that you put your whole life on the line and give up your livelihood.
Yeah, so I should say that's mostly accurate, but not quite. I mean, I did the part about the livelihood is absolutely correct. I was in 1983, 4, I don't know, I'm getting these years. This is a sign of getting older. I had major back surgery. Mm-hmm. And I went from my 6'4" that I've talked about to about 5'8", I think, in overnight, literally overnight. Yeah, so I had discs that had collapsed and other stuff going on. And as kind of in the context of all that, I was also in the process of separating and then divorcing from my wife. Yeah. So that's the not quite accurate part.
I got you.
But my child was still around. She was still quite young. And yes, I had no clue what I was going to do. And it was really good for me in one way. And that's, I learned I could survive. So I kind of had some things that happened, like we had some really bad weather that enabled me to live for a month off of some damage to my car, and some other kind of things like that. And then in that fall, I got a job working at the Office of Handicap Concerns as working in what is called the Client Assistance Program, which was actually working as kind of an ombudsman between vocational rehabilitation primarily and people, their clients. And I was there for 3 years in a couple different jobs there. And then I kind of sucked my gut in and applied to become the director of the center we'd walked out of. And at that point, in the 3 years that we had walked out, every year on the anniversary of our walkout, I'd write something about it. You know, still not consumer controlled or something like that. They had hired 1 or 2 directors who were okay, but didn't last very long. But one of the things that happened in those 3 years was the national legislation changed so that independent living centers funded nationally had to become consumer controlled. The majority of board members had to be people with disabilities. So I was hired to help spin that off to a consumer controlled board. And I was hired by the people we had walked out on.
Wow.
So I became the director of what then now was called Progressive Independence and still is. And I was there for 3 years. And then I decided that it was time to move on. It was both personal and professional. And I got a job at the World Institute on Disability in Oakland in those days. It's kind of gone back and forth between Oakland and Berkeley physically. But when I worked there, it was in Oakland. My boss was Judy Heumann, who I'd met early on in that very first meeting for me. And they had gotten a grant for a research and training center on independent living, and I was hired to be the training director. So I was there for 3 years. While I was there, I met my wife, my current wife, Lillian, and Lillian Gonzalez Brown. And we started talking about this concept called disability culture, among other things. Clicked right away. I can talk about that more in more depth a little bit later if you want. But we decided for various reasons to leave the Bay Area, moved to Southern New Mexico, and started the Institute on Disability Culture. Wow. So we started that in '94, and it's followed us around the country. When we first started it in '94, we were making an income by writing. I was writing, she's not a writer, and presenting and traveling. We did a lot of traveling. In fact, we did so much traveling that we figured we were there about 6 months our first year. Yeah. And we, at the same time, we had a lot of visitors. We had so many visitors that year, we started a guest book. So it was a really busy year, and that continued for maybe 2 or 3 years, and then both our disabilities changed. And we couldn't do that anymore. We both actually went on Social Security disability. I continued writing, and okay, so now it's the late '90s. We're still doing the Institute. We're doing a little bit, but not very much traveling. And Lillian especially was really tired of being in an area where she wasn't seeing green and water. I really wanted, I knew I always wanted to live around mountains and water. Green didn't mean as much to me. And I was getting close. I was born in 1951. So I was getting close to turning 50. And when I turned 40, I had kind of made 2 goals for myself. One was to learn how to fly. And I realized in my early 40s that wasn't going to happen. I didn't physically have the capacity to do that. And to go to Hawaii. Hawaii is a place I always wanted to go. I think probably from the time Hawaii became a state, it's probably when I first was aware of it. But I always felt this connection. And Lillian had been there. She'd been to Oahu and Maui, I think. And she loved it. She'd actually been offered a job there, but didn't take it. So I was getting ready to turn 50, and I said, I really want to go to Hawaii. And she had a goddaughter who was going to get married in Sacramento. We were going to go to the wedding and then go to Hawaii. Our friend, David Pfeiffer, had moved to Hawaii, and he was actually the only person we were going to see that had anything to do with disability. We were going to stay at this resort area called Ko'olina, and which David said wasn't really Hawaii. And he was right, but we didn't know that. So, so we're getting ready to go. We're all packed, I think. And the day before we're scheduled to leave for this trip, I get a phone call, and the woman on the other line says, I guess you're not going. And I said, what? She said, turn on your TV. So we were scheduled to leave on September 12th, 2001.
Ah, wow.
Yep. So we didn't go. Nobody was flying on after September 11th. In fact, many people didn't make it to the wedding, including, I think, the best man. And we canceled our trip to Hawaii. So I turned 50 and still no Hawaii. And then in those days, my parents, who have both passed on, lived in Tucson, and we'd go there for Thanksgiving every year. So we were there for Thanksgiving that year, and I got an email from David Pfeiffer. And David said, we're going to be doing this symposium. Would you be interested in coming and talking about disability culture? It'll be in, and it was late February. And I said, yes, of course. So Lillian and I got ready to come to Hawaii in late February 2002. And on the plane ride there, I said to her, I don't think I'm going to want to come back. And she kind of looked at me like you're looking at me. You notice I saved that for the plane ride. I didn't say it before then. So, and she loved Hawaii. So anyway, we're in Hawaii. Norma Jean Stodden was the person who had put this together. They were graduate seminars for the classes she was teaching in those days, students she was teaching. And I did my thing in disability culture. And actually, as it turned out, Lillian, who wasn't going to work, probably worked more than I did because she was involved in video interviewing. You should ask Norma Jean about that and see if they have those. I think Sarah Banks was involved in that too. And so we were staying at the Sheraton Waikiki. And one day I was sitting out there. Remember, we're thinking we want to move from Las Cruces, but we don't know where. So one day I'm sitting outside the Sheraton Waikiki and I look up across the ocean and back at the Green Mountains and think, why aren't we here? So we started talking to people, and we didn't know Bob very well at all. We, I think, met him at a social event while we were there, and that was about it. Pac Rim was going on right after this symposium, but we didn't go to that because we wanted to see the island. But we started talking about, well, what can we do to move here? This is, I guess, March by now because it was early March. And Bob agreed to offer both of us positions as non-paid positions as something called a resident scholar. And that enabled us to qualify for student housing. And that enabled us on our SSDI budget, quote unquote budget, to move to Hawaii. And so this was in early March. We were there in June, I think. I sometimes say Lillian got caught up in my tornado of that move. But that's how we got to Hawaii. And then after we got there, neither one of us had jobs at CDS, but we had this designation as resident scholar. I started to do a little bit of teaching, co-teaching with Norma Jean, and I did that for about a year and a half. I was doing more and more of the co-teaching when my disability started really changing, and I felt like I could go back to work. So first I was hired half-time for a few months and then full-time. So I started working, we moved there in the summer of 2002, and I think I started working full-time in spring of 2004.
What was the culture like at CDS at that time?
Well, there were a lot of people. This is sort of a funny story. I've mentioned David Leak to you. So in those days, I used to drum, doing African drumming classes. And so I got my drum, and there was a class at the Y. I don't even know if the Y is still there, on by campus on Atherton. Atherton Y is what it was called. And so I got my drum, and I got out, and I was waiting for this class to start, and this other guy came, and we started talking, and he was asking me why I'd come, and I said, well, I'm with this organization called CDS, and he said, so am I. And it was David Leak. And so he was actually, aside from the people I'd met at that symposium, the first person I met at CDS. So, like I said, it was a lot of people, a lot of grants. I primarily at first worked with Norma Jean, and then with Bob. Bob is the one who obviously who hired me as the director, but also I was doing some work with him and others. So that's one of the aspects of the culture, is that it was always teamwork. And Bob, I think, was really great at involving people to utilize their skills, whatever they were, and to enhance them. So he really wanted to do that too. David Pfeiffer, who was there, he was a resident scholar too. I think he might have been the first one, because he was retired. He'd come from the East. He and his wife Barbara had moved to Hawaii, and he'd gotten involved in CDS, and he was kind of there as like a mentor advisor. He was very frustrated, particularly with the classes, by the lack of disability rights awareness, as were some people at CDS. And so there kind of was when I think about the culture for us when we first got there, there was David, there was Lillian, who eventually, because she doesn't have a doctorate, didn't find herself the kind of home David thought she would. Yeah. There was Megan Conway. And so there was kind of a core group of disability rights activists with Lillian, David, Megan, and I, and probably some people I'm forgetting about. And Norma Jean was incredibly open to changing the classes of the culture to focus on disability rights. She really wanted to bring that perspective in. So that's I guess another part of the culture is that there was a welcoming for that kind of new thinking. One of maybe the first PAC RIM I went to, when it was still in the Sheraton Waikiki and I was still using a motorized wheelchair, I would swear pretty much every person with a disability, and there weren't a lot of them, who was at that conference said, "Where are the disabled people?" Mm. Now, in retrospect, I know there were a lot of people with invisible disabilities, but they didn't, at that point anyway, talk about them so much. So we really worked to change that culture for visible disabilities, and I think it has changed. And I'm sure there's other parts of the culture. Oh, I should also say, CDS was split, physically split. So some of us were on upper campus, a couple different places on upper campus. Some of us were on lower campus. They used to call this something mid-campus. I don't remember if anybody was there. So I used to refuse to go to meetings on lower campus because there was no accessible bathroom within the CDS offices. So there was an accessible bathroom at Stan Sheriff Center. And my statement about that was, well, if we all go there, then I'll go there. But if not, I'm not coming to meetings down here. So it's lucky I didn't get thrown out on my head. But so anyway, that's kind of how it was as I remember it in the beginning.
So within that culture, and you talked about some of the folks, you mentioned Megan, and you talked a good deal about David. Can you talk a bit about how RDS came to be and how it fed into a lot of these ideas that were bubbling at that time?
Yeah, so CDS used to have, I don't know if this is still true, meetings of the entire staff, because there were so many of us and we were in so many different places. And also lots of people traveled. Some people actually weren't even in Hawaii that were full-time CDS staff. So we used to have meetings twice a year. And at one of these meetings, I can picture the hotel this one was at, but I can't think of the name of it. Anyway, David and Megan and Lillian and I tended to hang out together, and Bob and Norma Jean were sometimes in that group and sometimes not. And David had been the editor of Disabilities Studies Quarterly, and they tended to change editors every few years, and he didn't really want that. He kind of wanted to to bring it to Hawaii permanently and be, I think I don't think he wanted to be the editor permanently, but he wanted to facilitate whoever was the editor. So, and at DSQ, which is run by the Disability Studies Quarterly, which is run by the Society for Disability Studies, had some other ideas. I don't know what they were, so I can't share that because I don't know. But David was really frustrated, and we, Megan and David and Lillian and I and Bob, and maybe Tom at that point as well, thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting if we started our own journal? And what would make it different from Disability Studies Quarterly? And so we thought, well, make it international and really use it as a way to mentor students. Because all David, to some extent, Lillian, Megan and I, Bob and Norma Jean were all involved in teaching. And so, you know, we were really aware of trying to interact and do things with students. And so we thought, well, this would be a great place for students to publish, to hone their skills, to get into somewhere where maybe they couldn't get in other places because they didn't have the credentials. So we decided we'd start this journal we call the Review of Disability Studies in International Journal. And that's where the international part of the name comes from. We started working on the first issue. I was the editor at that point, the managing editor. I don't think that's what it was called, but essentially, or the content editor, maybe that's a better way of putting it. And so we of course wanted to work to our strengths. So the first issue had a thematic focus on disability culture, which David was also very interested in. In fact, David was one of the first two people that I know of still who talked about disability culture publicly in the US. He and another woman gave papers at a conference of what's now AHEAD, had a much longer name in those days. They were both called Is There a Culture of Disability? And that was, I believe, in '84. So he'd had an interest in it for a long time. Unfortunately, between the time we decided to do all this and the time the first issue was published, David very unexpectedly passed away. So now we had to figure out how to do this without his guidance. So Bob and Megan and Norma Jean, and Bob and Megan and I were primarily involved with content, Tom with formatting and those kind of things. And we were kind of grandiose in those days. I think the first issue was, I don't know, somewhere between 100 and 200 pages. It was very long. And the first maybe couple of years of issues, I think, were like that. You can check that out, obviously, and see if I'm right. And so for about the first year, maybe the first 2 years, I continued in that role. And then I think I went from, in that process, I went to more work at CDS, and I didn't have the capacity to stay in that role. And Megan took that over, which was probably really great because she really built it to where it is today. And yeah, she did a wonderful job. So when we started it, we had that idea of mentoring students, and we did, I think. We liked the international part, and we actually at some points even had a couple of articles that were published in an international language and then in English. We had one, I think, in French and English, and I forget. I know we had one or two other ones. We definitely had students who not only published, but published some fairly significant articles. And we did reviews. So we did book reviews and music reviews, which I facilitated for as long as I was employed at CDS. Yeah, and there we go. That's RDS.
Thank you. And you mentioned at the beginning of this that the way that RDS eventually flowered had to kind of by necessity be done in the absence of David, who passed away. Can you talk a little bit about how the Pfeiffer Library got started?
Yeah, yeah, this is kind of a funny story. So David and Barbara, David's wife, and Lillian and I all had lots of books and magazines and other things related to disability around our apartments. We all both had apartments. And we didn't really want them all. We thought it'd be a great idea to get them into a library. So Norma Jean had a friend at Hamilton, I think. It might have been Sinclair, one of those two libraries. I think it was Hamilton, but she could probably tell you. And so she went and she asked the librarian, you know, if we donated these things to the library, what would happen? And she said, well, people would go through them and we probably wouldn't keep any magazines or newspaper kind of things. And the books, we would keep the things that are of interest. The problem was they didn't know disability. So we all said, that's not a great idea. This is not what we want to do. What if we start our own library at CDS? And so we all agreed to do that. And then we started doing that. And in that process was the time that David had passed away. So it became the David Pfeiffer Disability Pride Memorial Library. I think that's the name of it, something like that. And then it grew over the years to, when I left CDS at least, it had its own room in the CDS building. And we, for a couple of years, we had a person who had a library science background, and she did a lot of organizing of the library. Belinda was the first person who was the keeper of the library and people who checked out books and stuff. And then that changed, and she might still do that actually for the checking out. But yeah, and she's the first person who organized it. And then Aaron, who was there for a couple of years, did a lot of organizing of it.
So Steve, with the library and with RDS, you painted a picture of a very creative culture that when it notices something's not there, it says, okay, let's do it ourselves. Can you mention?
Yes, and I think that's Bob. Bob is great at that. And at facilitating that, but also great personally at doing that.
And making that happen.
Yeah.
Are there other initiatives that you might want to mention that flowered during your time there?
Well, you know, when you say initiatives, I have to really think about that. I mean, we had a lot of grants. Of course, I was involved in one. The first one I was involved in was one where we worked with several other universities, and it was working with AmeriCorps, and it was primarily working with volunteers with disabilities and trying to, and AmeriCorps volunteers with disabilities, and with AmeriCorps to get more volunteers with disabilities. So, so one of the things that represented actually of the culture is that working with other universities. I mean, we were really good at collaboration. I think that was and is, I'm sure, part of the culture. Not everyone does that, so that was something that was, I don't want to say unique, but it was part of the CDS culture. Norma Jean worked herself very hard, and she was not the first person to start this process, but she was the person who finished the process of getting our classes to become a certificate program. And so she facilitated our disability studies classes becoming a certificate in disability and diversity studies. And at that point, there weren't many other programs like that around the country. There are now, but I used to keep a record, and that's not even the right word. I used to keep a file of what universities, primarily in the US and then expanded internationally, had disability studies programs. And I think when I first started that, it was maybe half a dozen. There were more that had disability studies classes, but disability studies programs were very few. Syracuse had one, we had one, and some other, Chapman University, I think, had one in San Diego area. There weren't a lot of them. Now there's probably dozens. So, so we were at the forefront of that, I think. We were also at the forefront, I think, probably by necessity, but that's okay, of doing online classes with our disability studies. And the reason we did that was we weren't getting enough students doing in-person classes, so we wanted to broaden it. And the other thing that was really great, I don't know if this is still true, but at that point, if you did online classes via the outreach college, you paid in-state tuition, no matter where you were. So we had that appeal. When I was teaching, I created 2 classes. So this is again the aspect of being able to create when you see a need. So I created a class called, now I can't even remember the name of it, History of Disability. Is that it?
Homer to hip hop?
Yeah, that's the after the colon. I'm trying to remember what's before the colon.
Disability culture?
Disability history and culture.
Yeah.
From Homer to hip hop. And actually I never meant hip hop. I meant crip hop. But I couldn't say that because nobody would have known what the heck I was talking about. So anyway, I created that class, which at first was both an undergrad and a grad class. And then eventually the powers that be at the university didn't like that. So they made us create a separate grad class, which is, I think it's called Disability History Through the Ages. So I created those 2 classes, and the point of that is not so much the creation of them, it's who the students were in the beginning and who they became. So in the beginning, it was primarily people from the College of Education, where CDS is, sociology, psychology. We did in the early days, before it was online, we had an architecture student, but it wasn't a lot of that. By the time I left in 2018 or 19, I forget which one, we had students from the sciences, we had students, pre-med students, we had students from all kinds of disciplines. In fact, we had probably more students from other disciplines than from education. So and part of what happened, and the reason that draw was there, was it became a writing intensive class. So it fulfilled one of the focus areas for the university. But it was also that people were interested in disability. It also fit the culture requirement. And I'm talking about my classes because that's what I know best, but I'm sure this applies to other classes as well. Now, how did I get on all that?
Well, no, again, we were talking about the culture at CDS and this kind of creative energy of responding where things didn't exist and making that happen. I wanted to ask you too, thinking about that, with that in the back of our head, you mentioned your draw to Hawaii and how meaningful being in Hawaii was to you. I wanted to ask you how being in Hawaii and Hawaiian culture impacted you and your work.
Well, so let me say a couple of things about Hawaii. For me personally, it's the only place I've ever lived that I really felt like I was home. And there's a saying there, home at heart, even if you're not native Hawaiian or you didn't grow up in Hawaii. And that was me, absolutely. But there were some downsides, especially from a disability perspective. So we literally knew no one who had an accessible house, completely accessible house. We knew one person who used a ramp to get us into their living room, Bob and Norma Jean, and that was great. And they were very gracious about that. And then we had another friend who you could easily get into their house, but not their bathrooms. So, and that's not atypical anywhere, but it is frustrating when you can't visit people. And it was really hard for Lillian, especially, who used a motorized wheelchair the entire time we were there, which my disability changed a bit and I didn't, to travel. And so she wasn't able to travel to any of the other islands. And she wasn't easily able to get off Oahu. So that was one of the reasons we left, is from a disability perspective. Okay, now back to your question. So there was this wonderful guy. His name was George Kanalu Young, George Terry Kanalu Young. And he was a historian with a disability who was also Native Hawaiian. And Kelly Roberts and I co-taught for a while. We used to teach the multicultural classes. And one year, we were still doing the in-person classes in those days. And one year we asked Kanalu if he'd guest lecture. We had a lot of guest lecturers in those classes, especially the multicultural class. And he said, sure. And we met at the Hawaiian Studies area. And he came in, and he knew Hawaiian history and he knew disability history. And I'm saying the past tense because he's no longer with us, although there's a really good documentary about him that Marlene Booth made called, I think it's called Standing Tall.
Yeah.
Yeah. And anyway, so one of the things I remember, I was asking him what he knew about discrimination or attitudes toward disability in older Hawaiian culture. And he made a really interesting comment. He said that in traditional Hawaiian culture, people with physical disabilities fit in very well. People with what we these days call emotional or psychological disabilities didn't, because it was harder for them to fit into being a part of whatever production was going on, how society, whatever the society was doing to produce food or whatever. And I've actually now seen that talked about in a lot of what we call indigenous cultures, that not necessarily people with physical disabilities always fit in, but that it's frequently harder with the psychological and emotional disabilities. Okay, so, but, you know, there's a lot of Native Hawaiians who are very aware, and other people, but Native Hawaiians especially, who are very aware that their land is being occupied. Yeah, so, and that's, you know, they would put it that way. Many other people might not put it that way, but we came in, we, the United States, came in the early 1900s and took over, and we imprisoned their queen. And so we did, we occupied their lands. And that connects very well with the ideas of oppression that people with disabilities have experienced. So in addition, there's this amazing Native Hawaiian culture of music and aloha and family, all of which greatly appealed to me. So, I mean, I can still say things like, "Are we pau?" Even though I haven't been in Hawaii since 2014. So, you know, and not too many people anymore know what I'm talking about, but Lillian does. So, so yeah, and the land. One of the places that I got to visit that is really special for me is Haleakala on Maui. And for me, it was a very spiritual place to be. And for me, Hawaii is a very spiritual place to be. So I was able to get back once a year for Pac Rim the first few years after we left, and then things changed. So I haven't been back in a while, but we both miss it. I mean, I don't think it's the place for us to live, but we both miss it.
Yeah. And so I know you've been gone for some time. When you think about CDS now, what kind of other opportunities do you think there are for CDS to serve the campus? And you talked about some of the kind of collaborations that you did during your time, AmeriCorps, and some of the other collaborations with universities. When you think about CDS now, what kind of new places could it go with that in that respect?
You know, well, my sort of off the cuff answer to that is anywhere. and I do mean that literally. So Tom and Megan and I primarily, not only, but primarily created a project called Employable. And we got a grant from the Kessler Foundation that funded that. And we were looking at, because employment, I should probably say this, employment was a really big issue for me, especially as I moved toward what I knew was moving toward the end of my time at CDS, no matter what happened, just from age. So when I first got involved in the disability rights movement in the early 1980s, the unemployment and underemployment rate for people with disabilities was somewhere in the neighborhood of 70%.
Wow.
Meaning 30% of people with disabilities who want to work were employed. When I left CDS in 2014, the number was about the same. Yeah. And so I was just, not only I, but I was really frustrated with the lack of change in that. And so we decided we wanted to really focus on something that had to do with employment, because we all were aware of this. So we wanted to look at it in a different way, a creative way, and we used Tom's skills and Megan and my skills, and we created this project called Employable, which was intended to focus on teaching people how to access employment, and maybe even literally access employment, through this virtual world called Second Life. And so we created Employable on Second Life. It probably still exists that way. Tom actually wrote his dissertation on Employable, right. So he's the expert on this. But what happened was, first of all, not everybody had the technology to do this. Although almost everybody had the technology to do computers in some way or another, but not everybody had the technology to access Second Life. But what we realized is we worked with something like 30 to 40 people. It wasn't a huge number. And what we realized is many of them didn't even have the skills to look for employment. They didn't have resumes. These were people who may have been college graduates, but they didn't have those skills. They didn't know how to dress. So we actually had to take a step back and start from the beginning with many people, not with everybody, but with many people. But the point of that is we tried to look at a really creative way to change the employment statistics. Unfortunately, we had 2 years of funding, and even though a lot of people loved it, we never could figure out a way to get more money, more funding, so it ended. But the reason I thought of it in the context of what you asked me is we did a lot of work with the engineering, an engineering professor particularly, and he loved it. He loved it, and he would have collaborated with us if we had continued to do it. And so, and in some of the engineering things that were being done were things like building more sophisticated wheelchairs. I was involved in a project called the Pacific Alliance on Students with Disabilities. I think that's what it was called. We just called it PAC Alliance. And it was a STEM-focused grant, science, technology, education, and math. Is that right? And then I've also seen people refer to STEAM, science, technology, engineering, not education, engineering. Right. Science, technology, engineering, art, and math. Yeah. And I've also seen STREAM, which I think the R is robotics, but I'm not positive of that. Anyway, so the point is that we were collaborating with people all over campus with PAC Alliance. We collaborated with, why can't I think of the name of this? The Oceanic Sciences Department, with etymology, with engineering. Yeah, a lot of, and we also did this not only with college students, but with high school students. So, so I think the areas of collaboration are limitless.
So thinking about all these rich collaborations that you've talked about and these all these different initiatives, in the moment that we're in right now as we talk with the current pandemic, and you know that around the country there have been all kinds of funding constraints placed on universities, and the same is true at the University of Hawaii. Given these different challenges today, from your experience, do you have any thoughts on best ways for the center to continue to flourish?
Well, obviously, I think to continue with an online focus. I mean, that's just the way of the world. It's been going that way for a while, and I mean, I've read for years that physical campuses may be heading toward an end. The pandemic certainly has increased that chance, accelerated that, if nothing else. But I think another thing is to recognize that everybody has something to offer. So that's maybe the other part of the creativity and collaboration. And Bob was really good at that. Bob didn't look at what people couldn't do. He looked at what they could do, and was very good at facilitating that. So, but not many people are gifted in that way. So I think looking at that is a really good idea. You know, we've spent however long we've spent now, and we have not really talked about disability culture.
Yeah.
So it's so, but I could and would and should. But the point of that is that that wasn't disability culture, which was my passion and continues to be my passion, was not something that was specifically a part of CDS. You know, there was not a project on disability culture, but it permeated through CDS, especially as I and others kept talking about it. So early on, I was asked to, you know, give presentations about disability culture. We weaved it into one of our grants, which was, this is kind of interesting too. This is teaching all students, reaching all learners, or reaching all students, teaching all learners. I always forget which way it goes. We had 2 grants for that, and we still have, I actually still refer people to this because there's a huge library from that project of posters, presentations, modules, and one of the modules on multiculturalism includes disability culture. So that was something that I was actually encouraged to facilitate, bringing that into different projects that I was involved in, and to sharing it with the entire really university, not just the school, because we did a lot of presentations at the Center for Teaching Excellence. That's what it's called, right? Is that right? Where they do training. So we did a lot of trainings there, and disability culture was a part of some of those. The point of it in what you're asking me is, it wasn't a specific topic that was the subject of any grant I can think of offhand, although that might not be quite right. But it was my passion, and it was something that was encouraged. And other people have other passions that may not be part of a specific project, but can be encouraged and can have an impact on not only on the project, but on bringing in more funding. So I think that's something to really think about. Teaching, there's all kinds of teaching going on now, and it's all, much of it, well, a lot of it's online, not only for college students, for elementary school students. So
Right.
there may be ways of, you know, looking at how collaborations can be done that way. If anybody could ever figure out a way to make money from publishing, that would also be a good way to do, a good place to go, because of course there's lots of people who write and publish there. That's all I can think of at the moment.
Thank you. And this basic idea of really tapping people's passions, and also taking advantage of these trends that we're in, of things online, as well. I think that sounds like a wonderful idea of trying to find a way to better monetize publishing as well. Now, coming back to disability culture,
Yes.
talked about this being a real passion of yours, and something that you've helped many of us around the country and around the world articulate. We talked about you're starting the Institute of Disability Culture with Lillian Gonzalez Brown. Some
Right.
has followed you around the country.
Yeah.
For those folks who don't have a working definition um, and who may not be completely familiar with the idea, can you give kind of a working definition to give them a flavor of what you mean when you say disability culture?
I can, and I will even quote myself as soon as I can find it, which won't be very long.
Okay, no problem.
But actually, I'm thinking about this. Can you share my screen for a minute? Is that possible for you to do?
It probably is. Let me
see if I remember how to do this from your vantage. I think under, where is it?
Pull that out of my hat here.
Under, well, because I'm not the moderator, I don't see it. But somewhere it says share screen.
You know what? By default.
Oh, here we go. Start share. Let me see if that works.
See if it'll allow you, because right now it looks like by default, and I don't seem to be able to change it. It's set to only allow the host to share.
Yeah, well, this is actually what I wanted to show you. So can you see this?
No, I don't see it. I don't see. Oh, wait. Yeah, good. We got it. We got disability.
Okay. So now let me go back a little bit. So I'm at the Independent Living Project in the early 80s. And, you know, I'm coming from a university, right? So the first thing I want to do when I'm learning something new is, especially in the early 80s, before there was YouTube and the internet and all that stuff, was read about it. So I went to the local library and I looked for books about disability, and I found two books that could have fit in what the context of disability rights. One was called Handicapping America and one was called Rehabilitating America. And they were both by this guy named Frank Bowe.
Right.
So, and Handicapping America, I think, is the latter one. It's more geared toward disability rights parts of things. Rehabilitating is kind of more geared toward economics. Okay, so I'm reading this thing that oh, I wonder if I can. Well, I don't want to do that. I don't want to mess around. But I was reading this news magazine about disability called the Disability Rag. And there was an interview in, I think, '84. It was called Emotion and Pride was the name of the article. Mary Johnson, who was editor of the Rag in those days, interviewed a woman named Carol Gill. Carol Gill was a psychologist with a disability. She's actually still around, but retired. A psychologist with a disability who in those days was practicing in California. And in this interview with her, she talked about there was a real need for a disability culture. And she was talking about how people with disabilities weren't necessarily born into a culture like people who are ethnically or racially diverse might be. But we learned our culture from other disabled people. And that just, I don't know, it hit me, it resonated with me. And it kind of pulled everything together for me, because as a historian, I love the idea of history and looking at culture. As somebody who liked lowbrow and highbrow reading and art and music and all of that kind of stuff, it all fit into this rubric of disability culture. And I got it right away that this was something that resonated with me. So I just started kind of reading whatever I could read. And in the late 1980s, I decided I kind of wanted to go, I didn't decide, I decided I wanted to go public with this idea. And there were very few people talking about it in those days, especially in the US. There were some people in the UK who were talking about it, and I kind of knew about them. I'd heard about this other guy in California who was a historian with a disability, and he was the first other person I'd heard who was a historian with a disability. His name was Paul Longmore, and eventually we met and became friends. And so the National Council on Independent Living is the Association of Independent Living Centers. And they have an annual conference every year. And in '89, when I was director of the center in Norman, I decided I wanted to try and do a workshop on disability culture. But I didn't call it that because people didn't really have that vocabulary. And I also was, in those days, nobody really knew who I was outside of kind of the region I was in. So I didn't think if I applied, I was going to get anything. So I called these people I knew or contacted. I don't know if I called them. I contacted them to see if they'd be interested in co-presenting with me. One was Judy Heumann, and she said yes. And the other was Justin Dart, and he said yes. And Justin Dart, for those who may not know, is these days often considered the father of the ADA. He also is from Texas, and he was in Texas when I was in Oklahoma, and we had met a few times. So Judy and I had what we wanted to talk about. I was going to talk about the walkout when we walked out of the Independent Living Center over consumer control. Judy was going to talk about this camp she had gone to, which is now very famous from the movie Crip Camp, but it wasn't in 1989. And Justin was going to talk about ADA because there was an Americans with Disabilities Act of 1989 that no one remembers because it wasn't passed. So Justin was actually really busy and kind of going in and out of everything. And Judy and I were really the panelists. And we decided that we wanted, I think we had an hour and a half. We decided we wanted to talk for 45 minutes and give the last half of the workshop to the audience. So I talked about the walkout. Judy talked about Camp Jened, which she probably used that word. I didn't remember that till Crip Camp. And Justin came in and talked about for a few minutes about ADA and then went out to keep working on ADA. So we did our 45 minutes and then we asked if anybody wanted to share anything. And I swear to you, Raphael, that every single person in that room wanted to talk. I mean, it was amazing. Judy and I left that room and looked at each other and kind of went, wow. Oh, by the way, I called the workshop Speakers of Movement, Voices of Independence. And and a person who was there later told me he thought that was my job interview for WID. So anyway, we left that conference and I went to Tulsa where we were facilitating a statewide conference in independent living, and I'd put together a panel called Disability Culture, I think is what it was called. And there were maybe half a dozen of us, and we kind of said, we're looking at this thing called disability culture. What do we think of it? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Does it exist? And everybody had different opinions about it, but it clearly for me was what I wanted to be doing. And I should also add that these days, disability culture is sort of part of our culture, our disability rights culture consciousness. In those days, it wasn't. It was actually a highly debated idea. Okay, so now I go to WID, and kind of like CDS, you know, WID didn't have anything that was specifically focused on disability culture, but I was able to talk about it a lot. And it kind of permeated, I think, the culture of WID. And then when Lillian and I were ready, we left to do the Institute. Okay. So now by 93, 94, I've presented about disability culture many times. I've written articles about it. Well, actually I hadn't written articles. I wrote a monograph, Investigating Disability Culture, Final Report. And that's actually what enabled us to begin with the Institute. It was a fellowship from a government organization. It was the first federally funded research on disability culture. And the reason that monograph got that name was that was my final report to the funding agency. Okay, so now people are starting to ask me, well, can you give us a one-sentence definition of disability culture? And I'm like, I can talk about it for an hour. I can write about it, but a one-sentence definition, I don't know. Okay, so now keep in mind this button And let me see if I can find what I started to find. So I sat down one sunny day in Las Cruces to write a one-sentence definition of disability culture. And I came away with an article. The article was really focused, the mainstream magazine published it, and it was, the title they gave it was "We Are Who We Are, So Who Are We?" And a lot of it was talking about power and who has the power to define something, who has the power to define language. So I didn't make a one sentence definition, but I did make, and I will find soon, a one paragraph definition. So, and I think, so I'm working on a book about disability culture right now, and that's what I'm going through. I'm trying to get to where I put my definition. Here we are. Okay, so here's my definition. People with disabilities have forged a group identity. We share a common history of oppression and a common bond of resilience. We generate art, music, literature, and other expressions of our lives, our culture, infused from our experience of disability. Most importantly, we are proud of ourselves as people with disabilities. We claim our disabilities with pride as part of our identity. We are who we are. We are people with disabilities. Interestingly, I've asked people over the years, you know, does this still resonate with you? Does this still fit? And for most people, it does. I wondered about this last sentence, we are who we are people with disabilities, if this was still needed. And I asked that, or I made that comment, I guess, at a presentation that I did. I'm gonna try and get back to you. Let's see. There we go. So I made that comment at a presentation I did over the summer, talking about disability culture for one of the mini ADA activities that was going on. And I got kind of bombarded with, do not get rid of that sentence. It's really important. So it stays. Over the years, and this is kind of why I put that button out there. So over the years, I had the opportunity to do a keynote in a conference at Taiwan. The title of the conference was actually taken from that article, We Are Who We Are. And the button was from a conference I did another keynote for in Thailand a couple of years ago that was about disability pride and disability culture within the context of a university setting in Chiang Mai, Thailand. So it's really gratifying to see that I'm not the only one that has to talk about disability culture anymore. In fact, there's a lot of people who have no clue I ever talked about disability culture. So that's not quite as gratifying, but it shows how it's grown over the years.
And the way that you're defining it, you know, of course, continues to resonate here with identifying the shared bonds and pride and identity. And as we were on the process of scrolling towards it, I couldn't help but notice different forms of your writing, including poetry.
Right.
Can you just say a bit about why you choose to express yourself in these very different kinds of forms to talk about these things that are important to you?
Yeah, so first let me say, when I first started talking about disability culture, I did it kind of like this, as a talking head with my university background. And I really realized really quickly that was not the way to get what I wanted to get across to people. And so I started using examples. I use music because I love music, and I use cartoons, Callahan, especially in the beginning, because he had very poignant cartoons, writing, posters, talked about movies and documentaries in those days. So in 1991, I believe, I was doing a presentation at an independent living conference in Little Rock, Arkansas. And I decided I wanted to talk about disability culture in some way, but I wasn't sure how. And I've written poetry essentially all my life. So I decided very consciously to write a poem that was a disability culture poem. So I did my presentation, and then I said I wanted to finish with this poem, and it was called Tell Your Story. And it has the stories of 3 different people and kind of what happened to them in specific situations. And one of my friends very nicely recently referred to it as a classic, which of course made me feel very good. And that's, you know, people learn in different ways. Not everybody likes academic writing. In fact, probably the majority of people don't like academic writing. But I have that tendency, having written academically for a long time. So I try to share as many examples, including my own, but also other people's, as I can. And the book that I'm working on is actually filled with them.
And you've also written for different specific audiences, like your work on Ed Roberts for younger readers too.
Yeah, so that came about in a really interesting way, I think. So when we moved to Las Cruces and we stopped doing a lot of traveling, I actually started becoming much more well-known in that area as a poet than I was as a disability rights person. And I did some poet in residencies at middle schools and elementary schools. I worked, well, I did some other things. They're not coming to mind, but the point is that was where my focus was in those days. So I don't remember why it came about that this was the topic, but in one of the middle schools I was there for a week, and Ed Roberts was the topic. So for those people who don't know, Ed was a post-polio quadriplegic who had the use of a couple of fingers on his left hand and a couple toes on his left foot, and also used a ventilator, slept in an iron lung at night. He got polio when he was in his teens, and in 1962, he became the first person with those types of disabilities to go to the University of Berkeley, and is frequently thought of, University of California at Berkeley. It is frequently thought of as the first person with those kind of significant disabilities to go to college. That's not totally accurate, but it's close enough in the US. So he did live on campus, but he couldn't live in a dorm because no dorm rooms were big enough for his iron lung. So he lived in a hospital, the health center on campus. He was there maybe a year, something like that, before another person joined him. And then by the end of the 1960s, there were a bunch of people living in this health center still. And they, of course, became peer supporters of one another. And eventually they gave themselves the name the Rolling Quads. So Ed himself became one of the first directors, maybe the first, I can't remember, of what in those days was called the Physically Disabled Student Program. And now it's called Disabled Student Services or something like that. He became not the first, but the first well-known director of the Center for Independent Living in Berkeley, which is one of the first centers around the world. And he also became a MacArthur Fellow, which is a very prestigious grant. And he became a director, the first director with his kinds of disabilities to become a director of a statewide rehabilitation agency, which was in California. I didn't know Ed that well. When I went to WID, I had met him once at a conference. I'm sure he didn't remember me. I remembered him. But he was very, very gracious. He really went out of his way. He was always late for meetings by the time I knew him anyway. And the reason was, well, there were different reasons, but one of the reasons was if he saw somebody with a visible disability, he'd stop and talk to them. And he felt that was one of his roles in life, was to encourage other people he saw with disabilities. So, and he loved baseball. that's something we shared. So when I first got to Whitty, he invited me to go with him and his son to a baseball game. And his son actually is about the same age as my daughter, so that was nice. So we did become friends. Lots of other people know him much better than I did, but we did become friends. And he died unexpectedly also in 1995, not long after we had moved to Las Cruces. And I really wanted to write a biography of him. So I applied for another fellowship, and I got a year's funding to begin to do research on a book about him, which was great, but it didn't give me the time or funding to do what I really wanted to do. So I took what I had from that year and I put it together as a book on a CD, not a physical book. And I wrote an article that was published in Disability Studies Quarterly about Ed and his mother, Zona. And I think it was called Ed and Zona Roberts, Disability Rights Pioneers. Zona, by the way, is still around. She's 100 now. So I did this week at this middle school, and the kids loved talking about Ed, learning about Ed. They did some feedback, which was really good. I actually found it not too long ago, so I was reading about what they had to say about that week. And that's when I wrote the CD. And I actually tried to find a publisher. This was like mid 90s. It's not that a publisher wasn't interested. It was worse than that. It was they had no idea why anyone would want to read a book about this guy. So, I mean, times have changed, obviously, with the books that are coming out now. But in those days, I couldn't even get a publisher to say they thought it was something that might be interesting in any way. So I did the CD. I sent it out to a few people, and then 2015, which was the 30th anniversary of the signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act, many of us did a lot of different things to commemorate that, and I decided that was the year to get that out as a book. So I went back, I made some changes. Several different people had input to it, including Zona. My son-in-law, who's a graphic designer, helped with the formatting of it, and had more pictures in it than at first, and we put it out. So now it's out. It's called Ed Roberts, Wheelchair Genius, and it's geared toward what they call middle grade, which is, I think it's, 8 to 13 or something like that. There's another book called Ed Roberts, Father of Disability Rights, which is also a great book. It's geared to kindergartners, and it's actually written by a kindergarten teacher. And when that came out, I was like, well, there's not really any need for another book to come out on Ed. And I communicated with her, and she said, oh, no, you've got to get this out. So she was very encouraging of me to do that, which I really appreciate.
So these different works that you've done and the different audiences that you've shared your work with, and the various initiatives that we've talked about, we talked a bit about how a lot of this was informed by your own body and your own body shifts. I wanted to ask you, I know this is an area you've thought a lot about. What do you think are the biggest misunderstandings people have about the ways the body heals?
Well, okay. So
I know.
I don't even know where to begin with this one. Okay. So I'm an energy worker. I don't even know if you know that. Do you know that?
Well, we've never talked about that, but some people have intimated to me this, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I do a kind of energy work that's called reconnective therapy. It was developed by a guy who actually passed away January 1st of this year. And his idea and what I work with is that we all have an energy body in addition to our physical body, trying to put this as simply as I can.
Yeah.
And that when there are, we all have this. I mean, just by being on the planet, we all have this. When there are disconnects between our energy body and our physical body, that's when we have issues. So the work of a reconnective therapy practitioner is to facilitate your body, if I were working on you, with you, your body to facilitate whatever it needed. So, so one way of looking at healing is that we all have the ability to heal within ourselves. It's obviously not that simple, or we'd all heal ourselves. But one of the things Hervig, who developed reconnective therapy, used to talk about with the energy body is that the energy body is the perfect blueprint or template for each of us. So, so we can look at that now. What else do I want to say about this before I say that, if anything? There's a lot of different ways people heal. That's one thing. So I'm going to give you an example of something that happened to me that may have had nothing to do with this. So when we were still in Hawaii, I used to take narcotic pain medication, and Lillian was taking narcotic pain medication, and she was having trouble with the insurance company, allowing her to take what she needed to take. And I just got really mad. I mean, and my reaction to that was, I never want to be dependent on an insurance company to get what I need. So not too long after that, I realized that I was taking my narcotic pain medication later and later every day. And I realized I didn't really need it anymore. So, so I actually worked a little bit with Hervig, because I have this cold turkey personality. I usually do things cold turkey, but I didn't know that that was such a great idea. So I worked with Hervig, and when I was ready to do that, if he'd work with me, and he did, and maybe in a week, I just stopped taking them completely, and I've never taken them since. This was maybe 2012. It's not that I don't have pain, but I haven't had the kind of pain that's made me want to take that. I've probably taken, well, I take some homeopathic things, and I've probably taken aspirin or Bufferin or something like that a few times. And I live with pain, because, you know, most people who are in their late 60s live with pain. Not everybody, but lots of us. So, so there's that. Now, here's where it gets really tough, and that is in connecting disability and healing, because so many of us have such crappy experiences with people coming up to us and saying, can I pray over you?
Yeah.
I want to heal you. Ed used to have this great story about being in Russia, actually. And a faith healer came up to him and said that she wanted to heal him. And his response was, well, you can try, but don't make me walk, because I don't want to lose my job. And then she leaned over to do it and got her jacket caught on his joystick, and off they went.
Oh.
So anyway, without any repercussions for either of them, any bad ones anyway. So, so I've also written, I should say, I've written a lot about this in a book that's called Surprised to Be Standing, A Spiritual Journey, because it's hard to talk about this in a few minutes.
Yeah. I appreciate that. I appreciate you giving us a flavor for this idea. Were you in the midst of your thought?
Probably, but that's okay. I don't know what it was, so no worries.
Okay, sorry.
No, it's okay.
If I could just ask you a couple last questions.
You may.
When you think of all your work, we've talked about your work before CDS. I didn't ask you what you're most passionate about right now.
Well, so for years, I've tried to figure out a way to combine disability culture and the energy healing work I do in a way that made sense to me. And I've written a little bit about that, but not a lot. But finally, within the last maybe 6 months, I kind of got the guidance I needed, which was, it doesn't matter what I do. What matters is if I love what I do. And so my two passions, my two loves are disability culture and the energy work I'm doing, or the healing work. So here's a funny Hawaii story. When we first got to CDS, we didn't have a vehicle of our own. So we took the bus a lot. And I got to know this bus driver whose name was Fuzzy. Our nickname was Fuzzy. And so one day, not long after Movie Stars came out, which was 2003, I was in I was sitting outside in Manoa Marketplace. And Fuzzy walked by, and I said hi, and I said I was really excited about this new book I had, and I think I had one with me, so I was showing it to him, and he said, "When are you going to write about healing? That's what I'm really interested in." And I was like, "What?" So that to me, that's a prototypical Hawaii story, because you would never expect, and we'd never talked about that at all. I was using a power wheelchair. He was getting me on the bus and doing whatever he needed to do, and we talked a little bit. I didn't go very far on the bus usually, so we didn't talk that much, but we talked. And for me, out of nowhere came this, when are you going to write about healing? That's what I'm interested in. And that's Hawaiian culture, I think.
And you listened.
And yeah, I listened. Well, I should say the last chapter in Movie Stars actually does talk a little bit about that. So I was already doing that, but I didn't consider myself a healer in those days. I still have a hard time with that. So part of what you were beginning to talk about was I've done a lot of different things, but I think they've kind of all come from a similar place, which is making the world better.
Well, when we think of all these things, and you shared their similar source of trying to make things better, when you give your work, Steve, what are you most proud of?
My daughter. I think you said work, but when you asked that question, that's what came to mind.
Yeah.
So, in some ways, I'm most proud. I'm proud of a lot of different things. So, one is that I'm still here. When I was in my 20s, I had no clue and didn't believe I'd live very long. So, I'm still here. I'm still making an impact. So I don't know, proud is the right word, but I'm happy about that. I'm happy I've been in a 30-year relationship. That's not been easy for either one of us, but it's wonderful. So, I'm happy about that. And, well, the impact the disability culture has had is, probably the most significant work-related thing that I've done.
What would you like to be your legacy?
That I made a difference. When we created the Institute, we created a mission/vision/purpose statement. And a few years ago, when I was still at CDS, one of my colleagues asked me something like, what drives you? What drives your work? And I gave her a really bad answer, I think. And I thought it was a really bad answer. So I thought about it some more, and I realized that statement is what drives everything. And it's, now let's see if I can get this right. I just lost it. Wait a minute, hang on. I can't believe I just lost this. I don't suppose you know it by heart. I don't know why you would. Let me see if I can pull this up, because it's in it's in the same thing I had the definition in. And I think it is worth sharing in this context. So let's see if it's on this right here.
The bigger our brains get and the more memories we have, the harder it is for our file keeper to go through it all and pick them back up.
That's a nice way of putting it.
That should be,
I appreciate.
I mean, understanding that is what happens, that it's kind of like a computer analogy. That,
Okay, here we go. Here we go. Promoting pride in the history, activities, and cultural identity of individuals with disabilities throughout the world. That, I think, is my legacy.
Yeah.
I would see that, yeah. And from that, we shortened it as kind of a motto to promoting disability pride. And actually, in the 90s, I guess, there was a traveling independent living center mobile bus that put that on their on the side of the bus that asked for our permission to do that, which was really nice. But yeah, promoting pride in the history, activities, and cultural identity of individuals with disabilities throughout the world is what drives, I think, everything I do, including the healing work.
Steve, thank you so much. I know there's a lot we did not talk about, but I really appreciate you taking this time to share your passion and your work and your experience. Is there anything else that you want to say?
Thank you. Mahalo.
Mahalo to you. It's always a pleasure to talk with you, and I feel really honored to get a chance to share this with other folks.
Thanks. I appreciate that. I hope somebody's going to interview you.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that was really great. Thank you very much.